everyone. Welcome back to the Truth and Data podcast. I'm Debbie.
I'm Kim.
And today we are going to be talking about a debate that I hear a lot about in the digital forensics community and the law enforcement community. And that is the pros and cons between sworn examiners and non-sworn examiners. I hear a lot of debate, and a lot of people think one is better than the other. And I personally believe, and this is what we're going to talk about, but I personally believe that there are advantages to both. And while I understand that most agencies may not be able to have both, maybe after listening to this, you'll change your perspective. So I think maybe the first step is maybe defining what the roles are, like what we're thinking of as a sworn digital forensics professional and a non-sworn digital forensics professional. Kim and I have worked in labs or associated with both. I know in the lab that, or in the work unit that I managed, our examiners were non-sworn. We called them DFIs, we called them digital forensic investigators, and they were non-sworn. But I'm going to start with sworn, and I'll let Kim sort of talk about the non-sworn. Like a sworn digital forensics professional would be a certified law enforcement officer. They have arrest powers, they can write search warrants, they can issue legal process. It's often maybe a detective, an investigator, or a special agent. And they've gone through the police academy and have the legal authority to make arrests and, like I said, serve legal process. Now, their expertise in digital forensics is sort of often an extension of their larger investigative role, and so they're often doing a wide variety of things in any given investigation. So, what's your perspective on a non-sworn digital forensics examiner?
Well, just exactly the opposite in terms of they have not gone to an academy.
Right,
They do not
right.
have arrest powers. They do not. They are not. Carrying a badge and gun from that perspective, and so
Right, a badge and gun toter. No.
Yeah. I used to always say I'm carrying the computer, not the badge and gun.
Oh, that's good.
So, as most people know, I was a non-sworn examiner for a law enforcement agency. So, yeah, a lot of times non-sworn examiners have come from a computer background, right, or some kind of a technical background. And nowadays there are such great university courses and programs that are out there. A lot of times these folks have digital forensics degrees, and that's where they're coming from. So whereas like whenever I started in it, there weren't that many really digital forensics degrees, but my background was before I was an examiner, I was a database analyst and software developer. And so my undergrad degree is in computer science. And I went on to get my master's in digital forensic science, but from my perspective, I was the geek in from that perspective. So,
I love those.
But yeah, I too have worked in laboratories where we have both sworn and non-sworn.
So, while you said they may not have gone to the police academy and not have, the legal authority, they do have a different background, different education. You sort of mentioned some of that. Then they have many of them, whether they start or get certifications while they are working for a law enforcement agency, they have different skill set.
Right. And different capabilities. So I think one thing that I do want to go ahead and just kind of make perfectly clear is that what we are talking about here is that, whether they're from a sworn perspective or, from a sworn background or not, still what we're talking about is the examiner role within the laboratory of really they are doing the same work from an examination perspective. They are still doing the same types of exams, the same, work on exams. This isn't, we're not talking about someone in, just a limited, review capacity or anything along those lines. We're talking about truly, our keeping up with our certifications, doing our exact same trainings, technical trainings, and doing the same type of technical work.
Right. So there are, I guess in the sworn capacity, there's maybe a wide level of training. So there are some that have maybe a minimal amount of training, and maybe they know how to work like one specific tool, and they can triage things in the field and things like that. That is, while there is a role for that, and they have specific training, we are talking about those with the same type of training and doing work in the laboratory, as to your point.
Right. Yeah.
Okay. A lot of the sworn law enforcement officers too, they get into this, and now I think non-sworn is a little bit different, but they get into this because they happened to be the person that knew a little bit about computers. They had some basic computer knowledge, and there was a need in their agency, and they were basically voluntold that they were going to be the computer guy or the computer girl, and they were that's how they got into this. Like, you had a computer science background and went on to learn digital forensics. Law enforcement officers a lot of times become a law enforcement officer, and then because of the needs of their agency, then they become an examiner and go through some of the same training that the non-sworn examiners have. So it's almost like like some are choosing this path, and some are voluntold this path, but end up staying.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think also what's interesting, and Debbie, you know this, from a law enforcement perspective, is that you look at the backgrounds of like new people going to the academy now, right? And look and see what their backgrounds are, because most law enforcement agencies, they all vary in how much experience or education that you have to have prior to
Right.
coming to
Right.
apply even. But there are a lot of those folks who actually have, some computer backgrounds now.
Technical degrees.
Exactly.
So, you and I have had this conversation before. When I first started managing the work unit that I did, which was both sworn special agents and non-sworn digital forensic investigators, we were hiring, sort of to your point earlier, we were hiring people that had a computer science background, people that knew, for the examiner role. And by the time I left, we were hiring people with digital forensics degrees. That is starting to occur, maybe not digital forensics degrees, but that is starting to occur in the sworn ranks too. As young people are, I'm not wanting to stereotype, but they are more technical. They have grown up with technology. Many of them become sworn officers because they want to, but they also want to understand the technology and want to do a lot of that work themselves. So they are becoming sworn and then moving into digital forensics roles.
Absolutely. And then I think also, I mean, Debbie, you know this. I mean, a lot of people who go into law enforcement, they feel it's a calling for them.
Right. Right.
I mean, maybe it is someone who had a very technical background and have maybe a technical degree, or have a lot of technical persuasions in their life or what they like to do, but truly they wanted to be a police officer. So, and I think them being able to kind of navigate or find their way into these types of sworn examiner roles really fits well for them. And
I love it.
And I've seen a lot of folks that's kind of how they've navigated to get to this point. I've worked with, as I told you, I worked with sworn and non-sworn examiners, and I've gone through many, many trainings throughout the years, had many, many people in trainings, and I can tell you that I could not tell you who is sworn and non-sworn when we get down to being an examiner, right?
That's great.
Because there are people who have a very technical degree, but when they get into digital forensics, maybe things seem a little foreign to them. There are people who come from a law enforcement background, and then when they get into digital forensics, they just, it all clicks, it makes sense, and they're phenomenal, and they do so very well. So once you kind of move into that examiner role, it absolutely makes no difference, which is great from the perspective of being an examiner, right? Because as an examiner, you have, we are told that we are to be that dispassionate scientist, if you will.
Right.
And that we are to have, no bias, and that we are, no preconceived conclusions and, just to have that perspective. And so when folks cross over into that examiner role, it kind of takes that away, if you will, but in a good
Right.
way.
Right. So if we talk about this maybe being a complementary relationship, because I believe that it can be. Like I said, our examiners were non-sworn. There are some agencies that feel as though their examiners need to be sworn. A lot of that revolves around the fact that I believe maybe an antiquated view of things, that anyone who is non-sworn should not have access to certain information. And I think personally, I think that's ridiculous. Anyone who is a law enforcement professional is bound by the same, rules and for confidentiality and things like that. So but I have heard that argument before. And I think that's completely antiquated. But like, as far as them, like the differences or the like it being a complementary relationship, sworn examiners often sort of pull double duty. They can be on the scene of a crime, which non-sworn examiners do. Our non-sworn examiners went on every search warrant with us, and the sworn special agents were doing the interview. They were making entry. They were doing the interviews. They were collecting evidence, and the non-sworn examiners were triaging. So I know that they can go on scene, but in some agencies that doesn't happen. So, as far as non-sworn examiners going on scene, but sworn examiners, they can be on the scene of a crime, they can secure digital evidence, and they can immediately begin analysis or triage without necessarily waiting for a separate examiner to arrive. And this can be, having an examiner, whether they're sworn or non-sworn on scene, I think is super vital in so many investigations, because triaging how many devices, whether you take a device or not, or immediate lead generation in some cases is vital. So I think that they're sworn examiners are sort of instrumental, and they can play a variety of roles, but non-sworn examiners can dedicate themselves entirely to the digital evidence. And so I think that's a huge advantage.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And we were the same way, where we would often take an examiner with us. We had, mobile unit that we were able to take with us, and, for the investigative group, and then one, doing the examination. And it was definitely helpful. I mean, and even to the point of being able to affect the arrest, let the,
right.
Let the examiner go ahead, take a look, preview something if they can,
that's what we
see
did.
what's going on. And then that way the investigators can go ahead and can make an arrest. Whereas, then it's not always a good idea you don't necessarily know all of the situation that may be going on in someone, especially in CSAM cases. You don't necessarily know what's going on until you, you don't necessarily know what's going on.
Look at the devices. I mean, right. No, and I think anybody listening to this would agree that a same day arrest on a CSAM case is always going to be preferable, especially when there are possible victims in the household, or, we want to safeguard victims and prevent any further offending if they are a hands-on offender. So absolutely making those arrests same day is vital. One of the things I think when we're talking about pros and cons is having non-sworn examiners, in sending them into the field, which I honestly think is crucial. But it also takes away from their work in their deep dive work in the lab. Can you maybe, what's your perspective on that?
Yeah, absolutely. It does take away from examiners being in the lab, but the hope is that one, this is a partnership, of us helping the examiners and the investigators, right? So we are trying to do the best thing for the case. So keeping that in mind, and what is the best thing for the case is, it is a good idea for them to go, but then also I will tell you, it's oftentimes a great idea for an examiner to go, because so many times you're able to actually, maybe you're able to triage some devices, or maybe you're able to preview some devices, maybe you're able to keep some of those devices unnecessarily from coming to the laboratory.
Right.
If you're able to, maybe look at something and say, yes, this is not something we would take, this is not something that's relevant, this is not, whatever it may be, that in the long run can actually keep you from having more evidence that you have to look through, more evidence that you have to triage later, or
So true.
and also, just in general, taking evidence that's not needing, disrupting people that, maybe there's multiple people in the house that have nothing to do with this, or whatever it may be. So I think that it's very important from that perspective to keep it in mind that, yeah, you may very well be taking someone off the, or out of the lab for a while, but it may help you in the long run. And also it may help the case too, that if there is an examiner, and this is something that does occasionally happen, is that if the examiner is able to go do those previews, get some, maybe extract some data that's going to help, go ahead and affect the arrest, so that they're able to go ahead and move forward with what they need to then at the moment. It may also, whatever is seen there within that preview, that may very well be enough that,
Right.
I've had it before where somebody said, we don't need anything else. The investigators come back and said, you gave me plenty on scene, I don't need you to do the exam. And then, it gets pushed through and everything's, I never end up having to do a full exam. Now,
Right.
it also can come back the exact opposite way, and they can say, okay, I know what you saw, but now we need you to go do a double deep dive into some of these things to make sure of, or to look extra at this, or whatever it may be. So it could definitely help. I'll tell you another thing that helped tremendously is that, there were a few times, um, two in particular, that it was very helpful that the examiner actually was there on scene because of just the situation and the things that were seen, as far as like the evidence, where the evidence was sitting, or how the evidence was there, or what was around the evidence, or even just, walking through a particular area of the home in order to better have in their mind what's, maybe of some pictures or videos that you may end up seeing later in the evidence. So that
Right.
may help.
Yes.
Or also, you could always go back if your agency does scene photos and scene videos, which is very helpful. And I've done that also for exams that actually I wasn't the examiner on, that there were other examiners on, and I went back and would watch the look at the scene photos and watch the scene video,
Right.
so that I could try to determine where some photos were taken, some
Right.
CCTVs. So
Very
that's
good
also
point.
helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, in your experience, was there ever a difference in how management viewed sworn and non-sworn? I know that you were non-sworn in your lab. How were sworn and non-sworn exam or people in general, not even necessarily examiners, viewed?
I think this is, a variant, or varies between each agency, obviously, in terms
Right.
of like, how the examiners are, or how civilians within the agency
You're
are
right.
are,
Yes,
are
that's it.
viewed, as a, as opposed to, being a sworn
Yep.
personnel. But I mean, I was very fortunate in the laboratories that I was in, where, as I mentioned, everyone was, you're treated the same from an examination perspective.
Right.
It's, you're all treated equally because you're all an examiner once you're in there. Any things that surround that, that may be something that goes along with the agency in general. This may apply
Absolutely.
to also dispatchers or intelligence analysts or whomever else as
Yes.
well. But as far as being an examiner is concerned, I mean, we all realized our forensic responsibilities and processes within these cases, and we all were treated with the. I always felt I was treated with the utmost respect.
That's
I
awesome.
had I had phenomenal supervision, for, and some, one particular sergeant who really helped to set, who helped to set a tone for the sworn and non-sworn. and kind of,
I think that's important.
yeah, and really, got rid of any kind of a line that there was there within the laboratory, at least, so that, because he did realize, look, we're all doing the same thing. We're all after the same thing.
Right.
And he, to this day, is the very best supervisor I've
I
ever
mean,
had anywhere.
I think it's super important. I know throughout my entire career, I worked in work units that had both sworn and non-sworn and civilian personnel, like you mentioned, whether it was digital forensic examiners or intelligence analysts. And they also expressed often that they felt as though they were treated less than their sworn counterparts. And I do think it is important for management, and I'm super happy to hear that you felt valued, but I do think that there are a lot of civilian employees, and I know we're talking about examiners, but civilian employees that don't always get have that same feeling from their management. So, if we extrapolate that or specifically talk about examiners, the skill set, I do know that so many management teams do value the work that examiners are doing, but I still do think that there are many agencies where the sworn, agents, whether they're an examiner or not, tend to receive a lot of the accolades and the kudos for working a case. And so many times examiners are left out, whether they're sworn or non-sworn. And I do think that that's just something that needs to be called out and recognized, and that it's up to leadership to help change that. To put that culture in place, I think that sworn and non-sworn personnel, whether, again, examiners need to have the same access to the same specialized and advanced training and equipment. And maybe in this case, it's, that goes both ways, sworn and non-sworn, right? I like the idea of maybe like joint case briefings, or case strategy meetings where both, both perspectives are talked about, and the same weight is given to people's, perspectives, or, their technical expertise, and formal recognition. And then one of the things that you and I have talked about is career paths for digital forensic examiners. Sworn examiners or sworn personnel have always had a career path in any law enforcement agency. But what have you heard, or what have you seen with career paths for digital forensic examiners?
Yeah, so it's not always is defined for a career path for civilian employees. Oftentimes, these positions that have come about for non-sworn examiners, a lot of times these positions have come about sometimes maybe just, as I say, onesie twosie positions. It may
Right.
not be where you've been allowed or have been permitted, or they may not have budget, whatever it may be, where they don't have a lot of folks there, where if you're only able to hire one person, well, then, within your HR system, you may not actually be able to, have a whole, series or of those
Right.
personnel titles, right?
Right.
So that might be a bit of a challenge from that perspective, and just kind of setting it up, because a lot of times, as I said, it might be that an agency has just started, and maybe they don't have that many of them, and that just makes more of a challenge for them to even have that career path. Sometimes within some agencies, as far as a career path is concerned, they may have various levels, maybe a level 1, a level 2 or 3 or whatever. And then sometimes that's as far as it'll go. And then even if you're a level 3, you're not actually going to supervise anyone. That's still left
Right.
to a sworn supervisor, maybe.
Right.
Or it could be where you actually do have a non-sworn supervisor. I mean, that's just going to kind of depend on the agency, right? And it's oftentimes, and we've talked about this, where it's a bit of a challenge sometimes for agencies to be able to hire those non-sworn examiners,
Right.
because you may be talking about two totally separate, groups of people that you're able to pull from a personnel perspective within the
Right.
agency, right? You've got, 500 sworn personnel and you've got, 200 support personnel that are non-sworn. And so now are you asking to have 3 extra people go through the academy next time so that you can
Right.
take them over here as an examiner? Or are you going to go ask for more non-sworn personnel to be added to your total salary cap?
Right. That's exactly right. Since we were both in state agencies, that's sort of how it worked, right? We had to ask for more positions. And are you going to ask for a sworn position, or are you going to ask for a non-sworn position? And sometimes the governing bodies that make those decisions are more likely to approve one over the other. Or if you are hiring, if you need a digital forensic examiner and you have a sworn position available, then okay, then it's going to be sworn. Sometimes that's how the decisions are made as to what type of position do we have.
Right. And also, here's another thing that we haven't really even touched on. And Debbie, in our conversations in the past, we've kind of mentioned this before, but it's law enforcement in general across the country is having a really difficult time in getting personnel, right?
Right.
Everybody's numbers are down. It's
Right.
for various reasons we won't even get into of why, not as many people want to be police officers anymore.
Correct.
So then, from that agency perspective, is it okay for you to take someone that was maybe, working the road to come over to work within the laboratory?
Right.
Or, hey, look, we can't take anyone that's actually, on traffic detail anymore. We can't take anyone off that, but we've got some money over here where you can hire a non-sworn.
Right. No, I mean, those are great. Those are great points and real decisions that law enforcement leaders have to make.
Absolutely. And it's very, and I've talked to you about this briefly, Debbie, whenever just talking about the role of the examiner and how really, we're all just an examiner when you're in the lab, right?
Right.
But
Yes.
there are laboratories that for various reasons may not have they may not necessarily allow the quote investigation to occur within the laboratory. So there may be very strict policies about like what kind of quote work is going to be done in the laboratory. And that's just to ensure that truly the examination, the dispassionate scientists, they're all there together. And I've even seen laboratories where physically they do not allow the investigators to work in the same space. Now, you can have a sworn examiner working within laboratory space, but if you're only doing the investigative part of this case, then they don't even allow them to work within laboratory space. And reason being is just to keep that separated. To
the bias out. Keep the bias out.
Absolutely. So, and a lot of times you see this within laboratories, especially those that have some very strict policies. Usually it coincide with accreditation and things along those lines. But it is just to ensure that it is truly just a forensic laboratory. There is no, quote, investigation that's going on here, which is why a lot of examiners say, I work exams, not cases.
Okay.
I do examinations. I don't do investigations. But even though that those terms have gotten kind of blurred through the years.
Gotcha. No, those are interesting points. We were, in our lab, we were, considering accreditation, but we were not an accredited lab. So we did, and we were the investigators, the sworn agents, and the non-sworn digital forensic examiners were in the same space, and honestly worked very closely together, but never once did the sworn agents try and sway or affect an examination.
Right.
But I do understand that's an interesting concept to keep the investigation, and I completely understand why that is important.
Right. Yes, I was a quality manager of a laboratory for a while, and that was one of the things in auditing other laboratories that you are ensuring is that indeed the work done in the laboratory is within laboratory space is only examinations, so to speak.
Right. Right. So, when we talk about, sworn and non-sworn examiners, you know, and salaries in general, you know, I don't know, you know, between sworn and non-sworn personnel, like in our agency, the salaries were fairly similar, but they were not similar. There were times where the examiners actually made a higher salary and than the sworn agents, and there were times when that shifted, and it was the opposite. So, but they were fair for the same amount of experience. They were fairly similar, and I think that's true at least in government. But I don't know. What have you seen?
So it's been interesting where, and again, you know, depends on agencies, of course, but like the agency that I came from, you know, there was a huge amount of turnover within all of the forensic titles, if you will. So not just the computer forensics folks, but I mean, like the people who worked at the laboratory, they're doing, you know, ballistics, biology, chemistry, you know, things along those lines. All of those, there's a lot of
Yeah,
turnover. And
right.
so
Same.
from the perspective of the forensic class of employees, it was there's been some bumps in the pay in recent years,
Right.
because there was such turnover, and in order to ensure that they were paying a wage that would allow folks,
Retention.
yeah,
Right.
keep folks there, rather than it being this, hey, I'm going to go get 2 years of experience. Yes, what I've got to look at is horrific content, but I've got
Right.
some great training. It's really cool work if you forget what the content actually is, and then you're able to leave and go get a higher paying job. And that's kind of what a lot of agencies were seeing,
Right.
was that's, you know, after 2 years, folks were gone. That's why some
Right.
agencies said, hey, if you're going to come work here, you got to sign a 2 year agreement with us,
Right.
or you got to repay all your training.
Yes.
Some agencies
Yep.
some agencies got kind of creative in how they did their training with their folks, where they said, you know what, we will train them on this one tool, and then that's all they can do for X amount of time. And then they felt like, oh well, we've got our money's
Money or
worth out of this
yeah.
person in terms of them having that training and the salary they've gotten. So if they were to leave right now, we got some work from them, and then
Right.
build on from there. That's kind of a difficult spot to be in from an examiner perspective, because of your trainings that you need and to be able to, you know, further your learnings. But agencies have tried to get creative over the last few years in doing that. But as far as I've heard it both ways, where I've heard sworn personnel say, I can't believe that this person in our laboratory makes this X number more than I do, and here I am carrying a badge and gun and getting people
I've heard that too.
shooting at me, and they're coming in, you know, on scene after we've already been there for 20 minutes securing the scene, and who knows what could have happened to me, and they're making more money than I do.
They also have a skill set that agent doesn't have, or that detective that person doesn't have. So yeah, no, I've heard these arguments as well. I've absolutely heard these arguments as well. I think that as far as retention and salaries, and look, if you are an examiner, whether you're sworn or non-sworn, you're an examiner with a few years of experience, you can absolutely go and likely double your pay fairly easily. So that begs the question, how do we get them to stay? And my answer is just culture and creating an environment where they want to stay. You will never make as much money in government as you will in the private sector. So, and law enforcement knows that as well. Like sworn officers know that as well. You know, we can leave and go and likely increase our salaries in the private sector. There are skills that law enforcement officers have that the private sector needs and wants. But I think creating a culture, I mean, we have a really cool job.
I know.
Like both, like sworn and non-sworn, we have a really cool job. So, you know, that it's much more interesting on a daily basis. It is mission driven, but also creating a culture where everyone is appreciated, where you know, where everyone is you know, on the same level.
Right.
So I do think that is, one way. I know in our lab, we sort of had both. We had people leave for the private sector. We had people retire and leave for the private sector. We had them leave, after maybe 10 years or so. But by and large, we were able to create an environment where people really wanted to stay.
Hmm.
And because they were mission driven and they enjoyed their job and knew that they likely wouldn't enjoy it as much somewhere else.
Right.
So, you mentioned sort of horrific content and viewing horrific content. One of the debates that I hear is, sworn officers, they enter into law enforcement knowing that they are probably going to see things that are upsetting, whether that's horrific car crashes or violence at crime scenes or, in this case, horrific content related to CSAM, those types. So sworn officers know that. And non-sworn examiners, I do sometimes wonder if maybe, if it is being explained to them what they will see inside of digital devices, whether it's videos of someone being shot or whether it's CSAM material or so I do think that it's important for hiring managers to explain this to anyone that is being hired for this role.
I think that's one of the most difficult things. Used to sit on our hiring panels when we would hire examiners, and um, I that was one of the most intricate parts of the discussion
Mm-hmm.
of, after, you have your interviews with folks, and then, your people on the panel are talking, and we're like, how do you feel like they will do with this content? How do you feel like they're going to do with CSAM?
Right.
Is it going to, work within them? And I'll tell you this, when I got hired, I had already worked for state police as a database analyst and software developer before. And so I already was familiar with, lack of a better term, the culture, and knew many of the folks, and, had worked for many years within the agency. And so the first supervisor I had, who did my interview, I'd worked with prior, he said, that this is going to be some really bad content that you're going to have to see, not so many words, but he said, how do you think you're going to deal with that? And I said, well, I can't really tell you how I'm going to deal with that. And I said, I have no idea. I said, all I can tell you is that I know that I want to do this work. I know that this is something that I'm very passionate about. One of my undergrad degrees was in early childhood development. Feel very strongly about, working these types of CSAM cases. And I said, I know that if I have a problem, I'll come to you with it, and we'll just work through it. That's all I can tell you. And I was
That's a
trying to
good
be as open and honest about it as I could, because even if you ask someone, oh, how do you think you're going to do with that? Oh, you don't know until you have to see it the first time.
correct. Yeah. And that's like, do you feel as though this would bother you? Yes, it's going to bother you,
Yeah, I
like
can't
it's
be human.
absolutely going right. So yeah, they are intricate conversations to have. And I know we had to have those conversations as well, but I do think it's important for because I do think that there are a lot of young people that maybe don't want to be a sworn law enforcement officer, but they do, like as you were talking earlier, there it's there it's becoming harder and harder to find people who want to be in the law enforcement profession for a variety of reasons. And there are people though that still want to be a part of the mission but don't necessarily want to have arrest powers or carry a badge and a gun or maybe have to use deadly force or but they still want to be part of the mission. And I always guide them towards digital forensics, but this is a discussion we have to have, that there's some pretty horrific aspects of being in law enforcement, no matter what your role is.
All right. And,
And
go ahead. Sorry.
no, I was just saying, managers also have to put the wellness things in place, but we can talk about that in a second.
Sure, absolutely. And I think that's actually kind of where I was dovetailing into this, was I think that's part of part of also being whether you're sworn or non-sworn, even if you were sworn and you knew that you were going to look at horrific content. I've seen sworn officers be very,
Absolutely.
get burned out and be go down the exact same paths as I've seen non-sworns in terms of the concern or the bother from the content.
Yes.
So I mean I don't think there's anything that can make us not human from that perspective, whether you've
Right.
got the badge and gun or not. So I feel like that a part of that culture, though, is making sure that um, that the content or that the types of cases that you're working is being spread out equally
Varied.
amongst
Yes.
everyone and
Yes.
is going to give people opportunities to not have to look at content that's disturbing constantly. But I,
Yes.
I mean, there's plenty of horrible cases. I always say people never call the police just to say hello and ask how you're doing. Everybody calls with a problem and there's something that's wrong and that's not right when they call, right?
Right.
That's the
Yes.
cases that we get. It's not to, hey, let's go look for Sally's birthday party on this computer. That's not what we're looking for here.
Right.
It's there's so much that's not positive, and even if it's a murder case and a drug case, even financial fraud, there's so much that you have to dig within, and it just takes a lot from you, really.
Right. Yeah. It can change your view of the world.
It really does. And there's just digging deep into people's personal devices. Like I
Right.
said, no matter what kind of a crime, that can be very heavy for people to deal with.
Right. Well, sort of as we close out, like because I sort of like the system that we had, I think there's absolutely a role for highly specialized, non-sworn digital forensic professionals. In our work unit, the sworn professionals they simply they wanted to get into digital forensics, but they were not as highly trained, as the non-sworn. There's all sorts of models, I suppose, and depending mainly on the size of the agency, most of the sworn examiners are, there's maybe one or two, and they are examiners, highly trained, but they also are the investigator, and they're probably also the analyst, and they're in smaller agencies. What is your maybe ideal, and I guess it depends on the agency, but do you have an ideal setup maybe for a lab? Or I guess it sort of depends, right? Oh, it depends. There's
Yeah,
that
yeah.
there's
It
that
always
phrase
depends.
again.
It
Yeah.
always depends. It always depends. And I think that there are a lot of laboratories that run basically like off of task forces, where you've
Mm,
got conglomeration of people from various agencies, and some may be sworn, some may not be
right.
sworn,
Good point.
and bringing folks together from various places, I think it's very beneficial for a lot of folks for various reasons. A lot of times task forces may have access to various tools and money and things along those lines, but it also gives you those opportunities to be able to work with a group, various groups, agencies, or various types of examiners and people with different backgrounds. And so I think uh, I always feel like that, variety definitely helps people, because, we all need to learn from each other, right?
Right.
We all have to learn from each other. And, if we're all cookie cutter and, came from the exact same background and everything else, it might make for a very efficient lab, maybe not. But it
I do
also,
like diversity,
I
so
think I think it
yeah.
helps us to learn from one another, and it just
Right.
makes different perspectives. So because everybody learns differently, everybody figures things out differently, and if we're able to, all learn from one another and use each other's resources as we can possibly, I think it definitely helps from that perspective.
Yeah, I don't think that the thought that an examiner has to be one or the other is valid. And I have heard arguments from agencies that say our examiners have to be sworn. So those absolutes, I don't really buy into that, I suppose. So I think that there is a place for both, and like you said, we can all learn from each other.
Absolutely. And I think it's just good, I feel like, to have an open mind, for agencies to have an open mind, because when it comes down to it, even if you are requiring that everybody's to be sworn, they're still looking at horrific content. As I said,
Absolutely.
there's, this is difficult for anyone. It doesn't matter if you've got a badging gun or not. It's not easy.
Agreed. Well, is there anything else in closing? Any other points?
I think
No?
that's about it.
Okay. Well, I've enjoyed our conversation, and I guess we'll see you on the next episode.
All right, thanks. Bye.
Bye.